It's a third attack on a major NATO military hub within a week. Is this the Taliban's answer to the promise of a new NATO offensive? And what will be the impact on coalition operations as some nations consider withdrawing their forces from Afghanistan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The Taliban strikes at yet another airbase of the coalition forces in Afghanistan. 5 rockets hit the base, and in an apparent change in tactic, this was followed by a ground assault. Several people were wounded, but none killed. It coincided with the first visit of the UK's new Foreign Secretary, William Hague, and Defence Secretary, Liam Fox, to Afghanistan. They were forced to cancel a scheduled trip to meet British troops on the base in Kandahar. Earlier this month, the Taliban launched Al-Fatah, what is described as a new offensive aimed at NATO-led forces, the Afghan government and their allies. The Kandahar attack was a third major assault in less than a week. Last Wednesday, Taliban militants attacked NATO's biggest airbase located in Bagram, 60 kilometers north of Kabul. 9 soldiers were wounded and 1 contractor killed. This in turn followed a suicide car bomb attack in Kabul that killed 12 Afghans, 5 American and 1 Canadian soldier. So how extensive are the casualty figures of the coalition forces? The US has sent more than 86,000 troops, of which over 1,000 have been killed. The United Kingdom has deployed 9,500 soldiers and nearly 300 have lost their lives. Canada has sent nearly 3,000 soldiers and suffered 133 fatalities. And the Netherlands has sent almost 2,000 troops, of which 21 have been killed. With the death tolls increasing, both Canada and the Netherlands have expressed a desire to withdraw troops from Afghanistan within the next year. NATO has also announced that UK troops will now fall under US command. Well, joining our discussion today are our guests. In Doha, Robert Baer, a former CIA field officer and intelligence columnist for Time magazine. And in London, Afghanistan expert and author of Reaping the Whirlwind, Al-Qaeda and the Holy War, Michael Griffin. Let's begin with Robert Baer. Is this upsurge in Taliban action essentially aimed at preempting the pledged coalition operation, which is aimed at, among other things, securing Kandahar?
I'm not so sure it's about preempting an action against Kandahar as part of a larger offensive, which has been gathering for some time now. They call it a summer offensive, but I think that the Taliban know that they cannot stop this operation in Kandahar, but what they want to show is that they're on the ground and they will continue to attack, and they were not affected by the taking of Marja a couple months ago.
Oh, Michael Griffin, we do seem to see a slight difference in tactic here. In the latest attack, for example, rockets followed by a ground assault, an almost conventional attack. Is there any significance in this?
I think you have to look at a lot of the Taliban response to the surge of Stanley McChrystal in the south of Afghanistan, but also obviously in the center, as being rather purely symbolic, intended to attract the attention of the world's media, and quite well aware that if it's going to have any serious impact on these major bases, it's going to be almost accidental. So yes, there was 9 injuries in Bagram, but there was never any really serious possibility that they would break in and overrun that base. There are 10,000 troops and innumerable pieces of aircraft. So it had an impact because of its apparent daring and the fact that it did have some casualties in effect. The same really went for Kandahar. Throwing over a few missiles, not particularly well targeted, usually not even properly targeted, you're going to hit something in a large base like that, and you're going to have a global impact in terms of media coverage, and you're going to affect the perceptions of this war, but you're not going to change the nature of this war at this time.
So are you seeing this, Michael, essentially as a PR operation rather than having any effect on the actual forces themselves?
Well, I think to a large extent a lot of militant activity in Afghanistan is designed as PR, as psychological operations to, in a sense, condition Western audiences, Middle Eastern audiences to the notion that it is actually it's winning, it is a winnable war from the Taliban point of view, and it's an attritional way of fighting a war. Obviously, it's much more effective if you can have if you can have a precision attack on, for example, UN guest houses in Kabul. But the fact, and that has an impact, but the fact you don't continue to keep attacking UN guest houses or other aid guest houses in that city means that you are simply taking one strike and taking the result in media terms of that strike as being your immediate reward in terms of the psychological war.
Robert Baer, we've had Lawrence McChrystal in station for a period of time now, who had promised new tactics in terms of dealing with the Taliban. In particular, we do appear to have seen a far greater use of the tactics of the insurgents themselves, in effect, guerrilla tactics, almost a switch around, while the one side is using conventional methods and the other side is now adopting the methods that were used against them before. Is this intentional?
On McChrystal's part, I mean, what the problem McChrystal has is not that we're outnumbered in any sense, or that, as Michael said, these bases are takeable, but it's an absence of intelligence. It's a failure on the part of the CIA. It's a failure on the part of the military. We simply cannot get inside these resistance groups, the Taliban. There are multiple groups. They don't communicate with electronic communications. Many of them are family-based, and our intelligence is just bad on this, and McChrystal is completely frustrated. I mean, I don't think he's worried about these attacks on the bases necessarily, but in order to make any sort of progress in the countryside or retake the countryside at night, he can't do it without good intelligence. And he's very worried about civilian casualties, collateral, because it just adds to the resistance.
But the issue of intelligence is itself should be part of an operation. Would it not be a greater degree of intelligence being accessed if there was a greater degree of interaction with local communities? Is that not part of the strategy?
Ideally it would be, but nobody speaks Pashtun. You look at American forces, the CIA, and nobody speaks Pashtun. They are using Dari speakers, Persian speakers as intermediaries. And it appears to the local Pashtuns that we've taken sides with the Tajiks who speak Dari.
Michael Griffin, would you like to pick up on this, that the issue of intelligence and the failures of intelligence gathering?
Well, I agree with this position that the majority of interpreters and people who are translating intelligence documents for the United States and NATO forces tend to come from Dari-speaking areas in the north. And there is a perception, I think, in the south that the command structure of the Afghan National Army is predominantly northern, although the minister is Pashto, and that actually being recruited into the largest job creation schemes in Afghanistan right now, which are the army and the police, is very dangerous for people in the young males in the south to do, because they immediately become target of familial revenge patterns. They will get taken out by the Taliban, or they be taken out by members of other clans. So it's a very dangerous split that's taking place between the north and the south. I think Robert is in a better position to talk about the lack of overall intelligence by the CIA, although changes in the structure of intelligence in the past week in Washington might be one indication of that. And of course, the attack on the CIA listening base in Khost earlier this year was an indication of how badly they have been undermined to a large extent by Taliban intelligence itself. It's always been said, I mean, over the past 2 or 3 years, by superior military figures in Kabul, that the Taliban is winning the psychological war, and that kind of means the intelligence war at the same time. So to some extent the South is impervious, but it should be said that the South is not as united as it would seem in its resentment of US or the Karzai government's presence there.
Robert Baer, to continue this intelligence issue, and under the Obama administration, the majority, it does seem, of commanding officers, generals, appear to be from special forces background. We've seen it obviously in Afghanistan, in Iraq. There have been some very senior officers deployed who are of special forces background. One estimate was that it's as many as 15% of the appointments. Now, this is a complete reversal of what happened before. Is this, in fact, aimed at filling this intelligence gap that you've put your finger on?
Well, the special forces are divided, if I can use the vernacular, between the shooters and people who can deal with the local populace and counterinsurgency. McChrystal comes from the school of knocking down doors and shooting anybody in a house that moves, which is a problem. And the fact is the United States has no really depth in the military or the CIA in Afghanistan. I worked in the 80s helping the opposition against the Soviet Army, but this was very much a hands-off exercise. It was just a matter of giving weapons to the Pakistanis, who gave them to the Afghan Mujahideen, and we never did develop any depth among the Pashtun or even among the Tajiks. So the United States is, like any other country, going into Afghanistan blindly. And I would like to add as well that part and parcel of this offensive against Kandahar are the predator strikes in Waziristan and the tribal areas between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And what we keep on forgetting, and it's actually a lie that circulates in Washington, that these weapons are getting more precise. But the fact is that every time you fire a Hellfire missile into a house in any part of the tribal areas, you are killing innocent people, family members, and we are adding to a blood feud. And it's true. And another problem is the fact is the Taliban isn't united. There are multiple Talibans, multiple leaders, and the CIA is reduced to identifying a predominant leader like a Haqqani around Kandahar. So that makes, if you can't identify the commander of the Taliban, that just tells you how bad the problem is.
Let's consider for a moment the unity of the coalition itself, the NATO forces. There's a new British government in power, and the long-term Afghanistan policy is still to be clarified. In an interview with the UK-based newspaper The Times, Liam Fox, Britain's defence minister, caused a bit of a stir when he said that the UK was not in Afghanistan, and I quote, for the sake of the education policy in a broken 13th century country. A few days later, he clarified his stance regarding the involvement of British troops.
What I was pointing out, and I welcome the chance to amplify it, is that the primary reason for sending our armed forces to Afghanistan was one of national security, and I think that has to be the reasons against which we ever deploy our armed forces. But clearly, if we're to make the long-term gains that will provide the stability to maintain the momentum when our armed forces eventually hand over to the forces of the Afghans, we will require a long period of development in concert with the international authorities, the NGOs, and our own and other countries' aid programs.
Now, for his part, President Barack Obama has said the US needs its allies to stand with it in Afghanistan.
Burdens of this century cannot fall on our soldiers alone. It also cannot fall on American shoulders alone. America has not succeeded by stepping out of the currents of cooperation. We have succeeded by steering those currents in the direction of liberty and justice. So nations thrive by meeting their responsibilities and face consequences when they don't.
Well, Michael Griffin, we saw within recent months government brought down over the Afghanistan issue, that of the Netherlands. These actions by Taliban, the ongoing war of attrition, does this have an impact, and how great an impact does it have on the efficacy of the unity of the coalition?
Well, we're certainly entering a period of fatigue among all the member states of NATO. It's now a 10-year war, which makes it twice the length of the Second World War. It's not as well progressed as the Second World War was in half its length. Countries which served, like Holland and Canada, served nobly and spent a long time and a large amount of commitment, then now have to begin to readjust their directions and their compasses in the light of popular opinion back home, changing electoral schedules, and also the fact that we're in a credit crunch, and that foreign policies cost money. Foreign policies of this kind cost money. The divisions in NATO have always been fairly striking between fighting countries like Canada, Holland, and the United Kingdom, of course, and those who contribute but have restrictions on the ability of their soldiers to actually engage in fighting, such as Germany particularly. I don't think it's going to split NATO. I think it's going to require an extra mile of commitment from NATO, but at the same time, one can see the writing on the wall. This is a war that to some extent is rolling down, and the Taliban know that very well. And President Obama is about to go into a second elections for a second term next year, when he will have to show some kind of result in Afghanistan. So the waiting game that the Taliban play, and which is to some extent illuminated by dramatic attacks on US bases or NATO bases, it is attritional and it does work, but at the same time I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the direction of this war in terms of NATO and US commitment. They cannot afford to get out without showing something for it.
Robert Baer, I saw you nodding when the word fatigue was mentioned.
Well, I know the Americans are tired of this war. On the other hand, I understand what the President Obama is going through. He's about ready to pull out of Iraq. He cannot afford, as a Democrat who have a reputation for not being as strong as Republicans, to withdraw from another war. He simply has to sit out this war, put the best face on it, until the next presidential elections. He cannot withdraw unilaterally from Afghanistan. He cannot have his generals say, look, we're not being beaten, but we cannot define victory. And what he's hoping is people just forget this and we can reduce our losses. I just have never seen a statement by any American, either the ambassador, Eikenberry, or McChrystal, defining what victory looks like in Afghanistan. I mean, the way it is now, we could be there for another 20 years, and we still couldn't really call it victory. So I think a lot of this war is being driven by American politics in a weak Democratic administration. And that is going to be the dynamic. Now, what the Europeans do, and Canada is I can't comment on that. I don't know how bad the fatigue is there, but I can tell you in the United States, Americans cringe when they hear the word Middle East.
Well, that question that the phrase that you mentioned there, what does victory look like? What would a settlement look like? Recently, members of the Afghan opposition met with some ex-Taliban fighters for unofficial talks at a resort in the Maldives. It was first thought that the Afghan government and Taliban were being represented in the talks, but both have denied taking part. The outcome was inconclusive. All the closing statement revealed was a vague intention to hold more talks. The United States government says it was aware of the Maldives meeting, and for its part expressed support for any effort by the Afghan government to include those Taliban that have renounced violence. Michael Griffin, even the fact that there was some focus on this rather strange meeting does appear to indicate a degree of desperation almost in getting some kind of negotiated resolution out of the region.
Well, desperation there certainly is, at least on the part of the Karzai government. This peace jirga, which has been timed and which actually was the reason to a large extent for Hamid Karzai's visit to Washington to see President Obama. This is already long delayed. It's going to be continuously delayed because of Karzai's inability to form a government, and of course by the reluctance of the United States and other members of NATO to see a peace agreement take place, or even the possibility that it could take place given the diffuse nature of the Taliban insurgency, which we've defined already as 3 parts, but could be as many as 100 different parts, and you cannot make peace with all of them. I would caution one thing, and it's a little tedious to repeat history, but back in 1992, when the US pulled out after the anti-Soviet war, there was a great sense of betrayal by the United States withdrawal, and I suspect even taking on board the Taliban involvement in this conflict right now, the idea that the United States would again pull out in 2011, 2012, 2013 or 2015 would also be seen as a great lost opportunity for the creation of a different type of Afghanistan than the one we've all become accustomed to over the past 40 years. I would not put too much focus on the peace agreement, because I don't think it's going to emerge, certainly not without Pakistan assistance, and this will not be forthcoming unless they can work something out with India.
Robert Baer, you mentioned a bit earlier that this is a question ultimately of US politics. I mean, would you enlarge on that?
Well, I mean, this involves a personal interpretation. I mean, it's clear that the United States failed in Iraq to unify. We don't have a government in that country yet, and this administration is keeping its fingers crossed that the civil war doesn't start again, because in fact the Iraq, I know it's complicated tying these two wars together, but in Washington's mind they're very much tied together. In their keeping their fingers crossed that the civil war doesn't restart in Iraq. Simply to, in American political terms, is declare victory and leave, you know, we establish democracy, so on. That's the depth of the politics. In Afghanistan, the American public cannot differentiate between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And what the average American thinks is, well, if we pull out of Kabul, bin Laden's going to show back up. And what they've forgotten is that there is absolutely no evidence that the Taliban had any connection with the attacks on 9/11. But this is what Obama has to refer to all the time, is this oversimplified American view of Afghanistan.
Michael Griffin, another 30,000 American troops on their way to Afghanistan. Will this have any effect? Can it have any effect?
Well, I think its effects are going to be very, very much limited by whether Pakistan can be inveigled, bullied, convinced that sealing the border, sealing the retreat exits, the withdrawal points for Taliban, retreating from Kandahar, and also to a lesser extent in the east across Waziristan. The success is going to be dependent upon the Pakistan government collaborating on its side of the border in a major in terms of scale, but I don't think terribly offensive attempt to rid